radical defender of free speech. But what about incitement to racial hatred? Do you think that this should be tolerated? Do you think that given Europe's past, one should tolerate expressions of anti-Semitism? Isn't that a form of insult of the dead? And what do you reply to those who say, never again?
In Belgium, I guess, my position is considered radical. In the United States, it's considered conservative. I'm taking the position of the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, how can you be more conservative than that? One of the good things about the United States, it's my values, and I would like to hope that it'll be other people's values too. Free speech is really protected. Incidentally, that's not historically true. This is another example like slavery and homosexuality and so on. There's illusions that freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution, famous First Amendment. But if you read the First Amendment, it doesn't guarantee freedom of speech. And in fact, throughout American history, it has not been interpreted as guaranteeing freedom of speech. In fact, the history of protection of freedom of speech in the United States is extremely interesting, for one reason, because it's reached the most advanced level there, and it's recent. The first, the law is basically what the courts decide, not what's written on paper. The first freedom of speech cases came to the courts in the 20th century. And the famous early judgments that people hail as great progress were dissents in the Supreme Court cases. And first of all, and secondly, they were very weak. So the dissents still permitted the kind of repression of speech that would be considered intolerable now. In fact, I won't go through the details, but it wasn't until the 1960s, which is pretty recent, that the courts reached a high standard of freedom of speech. And it's interesting to look at the cases. They're very revealing. The first case involved the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. In judging in their favor in a libel suit, the courts struck down a law that almost every country has and that the U.S. had, the laws of seditious libel, which make it a crime to assault the state with words, basically. That was struck down in 1964. That means, expands the notion of freedom of speech. It was defending the civil rights movement. The next major case, a couple of years later, was defending the Ku Klux Klan, the most racist, violent, murderous organization in American history. It defended them, and it established an even higher standard of freedom of speech, namely that speech should be free up to participation in imminent criminal action. So if, say, he and I go into a store and he has a gun and we intend to rob it and I say, shoot, that's not protected. That's action in, that's speech in participation in imminent criminal action. Well, that leaves a degree of latitude, but that's the basic principle. Frankly, I think that's the right principle. Actually, that's a principle that was enunciated in the Enlightenment by Jeremy Bentham and others, and it's taken a long time to reach it. In my view, that's progress. It's progress as in the case of slavery, homosexuality, and subjugation of women. And it's virtually unique. Well, what about, I should say that this high level of protection of freedom of speech is almost universally accepted with regard to ourselves. So, for example, not far from here, there are august institutions like United Nations General Assembly and Security Council, where there's constant incitement, not just to racial hatred, but to extreme violent action based on demonization of people and cultures. In fact, there's incitement to the most extreme form of crime, namely what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime of aggression. Constant incitement to that, and demonization of those necessary to create as monsters to be destroyed. Furthermore, that same goes on in the newspapers and common current discourse and so on. And there's no effort to try to stop that. In fact, if you stopped it, you'd close down all the newspapers and academic publications. It's all over them. It's extreme incitement to hatred, to violence, to great crime. The alleged concern about incitement to racial hatred is very narrow. It does not apply to the major cases. We should think about that. Should incitement to racial hatred be tolerated? No, it shouldn't be tolerated, nor should incitement to war be tolerated, or all sorts of other speech should not be tolerated. But there's a gap, crucial gap, between not tolerating something and granting the state the power to determine what speech is legitimate, or even worse, to determine what are historical truths. I don't think we should grant the holy state the right to decide what history is and to punish deviation from it and to decide what kinds of statements are legitimate and what kind aren't. I don't want the state to have that power. So no, sure, don't tolerate it, but don't grant the state the right to determine what's acceptable and to punish it. That's a critical gap, which unfortunately is not made clear in Europe, I'm afraid. What about an insult to the dead, say Holocaust denial? I mean, the worst form of insult to the dead that I can think of is to adopt the principles of their murderers. Goebbels and Stalin would be delighted with the Gaissot law in France, which is allegedly trying to protect the memory of the dead. It's not. It's insulting them. You don't insult the memory. You don't honor the murdered victims of the Holocaust by adopting Nazi doctrines. And that is the doctrine that the state does have the right to determine historical truth and other legitimate expression, to punish deviation from it. Actually, I just add a personal note. One of my closest friends died a couple of years ago, was Israel's leading civil rights activist, civil and human rights activist, Israel Shahak, who some of you may know. He was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and Bergen-Belsen. Somehow survived, made it to Israel, became the leading figure in defense of human and civil rights, Palestinian rights, women's rights, homosexual rights, and so on. He was quite respected in Israel. He was selected for honors on Holocaust Day. One day a year they pick a Holocaust victim. His conclusion from his experiences was, yes, never again for anybody, not just for me, but for anybody. So that kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone, not just to me and my friends. That's the right kind of conclusion to draw, I think, from these horrible repression. Now, I don't know Belgian law, so maybe I'm wrong, but I would guess that if I stood up right now and said here that King Leopold didn't kill 10 million people in the Congo, he only killed 5 million, or if I said that the Belgian government didn't purposely murder Lumumba and throw the Congo into total disaster, including what's happening right this minute, namely the worst atrocities in the world being carried out with the cooperation of multinational corporations in eastern Congo so that you can have cell phones. If I were to deny that, I doubt that I'd be brought to court. You can tell me if I'm wrong. I suspect that that's considered, and that's pretty serious. These are some of the worst crimes in modern history, and they reach right to this minute. They're going on right now while we're talking in eastern Congo, where it's the worst atrocities in the world, all traceable to these activities, very recent activities. Well, that again illustrates I give many other examples. The selectivity reveals extreme hypocrisy. If there was time, I would go through the very interesting history of how Holocaust denial became a crime. In fact, just briefly speaking, at a time when it was possible to save Holocaust victims, to save survivors, there was almost no interest in doing so. I could explain it if you like. Years later, when Holocaust victims could be exploited as justification for persecution of others, then it became a big issue. That's exactly what troubled people like Israel Shachar.